Welcome to the Perspective Knoll. Here we launch chapters once a week from original stories and occasionally other creative videos. Feel free to like and subscribe.
Chapter 15. Return to Jordan's post. Once on the other side of the painting, everyone was standing around the shed and examining their surroundings. Laurie most of all was bewitched by the new world she had entered, and the fact that it existed at all tingled her senses. Anthony gave a smile as he looked across the field of tall swaying grass and stared at his parents' house, and it must have brought back a lot of memories. Harmon was already slowly making his way through the grass. "Well, here we are again," Charles said out loud and with a disappointing sigh. He thought to himself, more of a hope than anything, that he would never return to see this forest again after his task was done. "This is so amazing!" Laurie shrieked with excitement. "Charles, how on earth did you and Shawn ever get over this sight, this feeling?" "Trust me when I say, I'm still dealing with it," Charles answered and looked around the shed for any additional clues. There was nothing new or out of place, and with all their footprints, it was impossible to make out if anyone or anything else had come snooping around. The life of a homicide detective is a wild and tenacious world. "How was your first experience here?" Charles asked Anthony. "It was a shock, to say the least," Anthony began as he too was looking around and examining the tools that hung on the nails and bits of wood that were stacked in the far corner. "I still get goosebumps when I see the house there. I wasn't allowed to help much with building the damn thing. I was still very young when my parents were piecing it together. I was like 9, Anthony paused and then side-glanced at the painting. The image that showed now was of Laurie's and Shawn's living room. "Yeah, I don't think we should leave the painting in the shed." "Why do you say that?" asked Laurie. "We just don't want to risk Argatha to use it to come back into our world. We should take the painting and decide later where to stash it." Anywhere but around the house, Charles thought Anthony was making some good sense and let Anthony take the painting off its nail. "Before we get started down the road," Charles began to say before the group started through the forest, "we all need to take time to study all the puzzle pieces here and clues that might suggest that Argatha may have been here recently. Also, the medallion on Ed's neck, or whatever that thing is. And of course, Shawn's best and worst case scenario. I think we need to plan ahead for that. We are going to need more help." "Wait. You said something about the medallion around my father's neck?" Anthony stopped the group and eyed Charles. Charles eyed Anthony curiously. "What do you know about it?" "It was a gift from King Uriel. It was made from the king's very own unique skin. It's essentially bark. He is a type of tree creature, after all. I don't know much about the properties of the medallion, but my father never liked me asking about the thing in the first place, no matter how old I got. He never took it off. My mother had told me that even when he showered, it stayed on. That makes sense why it appeared differently in my so-called visions. It must have something to do with enchanted items, perhaps. Do you think it was more than a gift? Like it was used maybe as a way to track your father?" Charles felt like he was grasping at straws, yet another puzzle piece, and the whole project kept getting bigger and bigger. "Like I said, he didn't like to talk about it. I think my mother might have suspected something, but she never told me her theories." "Good point though, Charles. The sun is getting low, and we'll lose the light of the road," Anthony replied. "It couldn't hurt to get Laurie and I up to speed from the beginning from your perspective. We should rest in the house for the night and start out refreshed in the morning." They made it through the tall swaying grass and up to the house. The second that Anthony had crossed the threshold, a flood of memories filled his head. Anthony had begun sharing stories about his experiences there and the odd beings who would stop by to share a meal with him and his parents. It wasn't just the wood elves, but there was a group of wandering mercenaries who had stopped by several times to tell old war stories as they shared warm beer with his father, and helped build the shed too. Once they finished touring the house, Laurie, Harmon, Anthony, and Charles made it into the living room for a chance to catch everyone up. Charles laid out all the pieces starting with Ed's death and everything up to now. A very confusing, living mystery, with a whole bunch of twists and turns. As Charles spoke, Laurie was shocked at what she had heard, and even Anthony, who knows a lot about the forest and the creatures that inhabit it, was shocked when Charles brought up the servants of Errol. They all particularly enjoyed the tale of finding the ghost of Dale Shepherd in a graveyard. Well gang, we have a long and difficult trip ahead, let's get some sleep and hope for a smooth journey in the morning. Charles then clapped his hands together and walked out of the living room and into the kitchen, and then took a deep breath before he refilled his glass with water. "Are you okay?" asked Laurie. "Yeah, just the stress of the job is all it is," he answered and took a sip of water. "If I would have known this is where you guys ended up, I wouldn't have freaked out on you like I did, it's..." Laurie tried to apologize, but Charles cut her off. "Look, if I would have known that any of this was possible, I wouldn't have let Shawn come along in the first place. Hell, I might not have even taken the case and let some other damn fool try to deal with all this shit. But life is full of surprises, and we can't see the future. Human error is a real thing, and here in Lufforain I think it's a great place, visually. But something is telling me that at the heart of all this, there is an evil that could swallow everything up around us. I didn't tell you everything about Errol." Laurie shook her head and sighed. "He's a god. How much more detail do I need?" Charles put his glass on the counter and folded his arms. "No, Laurie, he's not just a god, but one of the nastiest here in this world. I'm pretty sure I saved that baby from him. I saw him rip through reality. I can't explain it. It's so hard to describe what I saw, but what I felt when I was able to see his hand reaching through that space above the table and the baby. It was something like a suicidal feeling. Like it was, all I wanted to do was to kill myself because that much dread had suddenly engulfed me. Charles, it's okay. Let's focus on getting my husband back, and once we return home in Arizona, then we can discuss the what-ifs." Laurie patted Charles on the shoulder and returned to the living room where she had a makeshift bed ready for her on the floor next to Harmon. The next morning, they were up and moving at the first sign of the rays of the sun coming through the windows. Anthony made breakfast with spam and the loaf of bread that Laurie had brought. The morning was filled with more stories, but not of Lufforain. Instead it was personal stories of each other's youths that made for a grand bonding experience. Harmon was not shy either, and he enjoyed their tales as well as sharing one or two of his own from his homeland in the Hiatus Mountains. They wrapped things up and cleaned up their mess, and before they left, Charles took the painting with them and strapped it on Harmon's back with some string that was found in the house. Anthony had agreed to show them the path that would take them to the southern gate of the Western Kingdom. Charles planned their path so that he could return to Jordan's post. Anthony led the way, and before they knew it, several hours had passed by and still, they had not arrived at their first checkpoint. Harmon kept reassuring them that they were headed in the right direction, but Charles got the feeling that they were going the wrong way. Laurie, on the other hand, did comment on the strange smell in the air, and Anthony had an answer, that the scent is what keeps everyone youthful in Lufforain. "It's the reason why Argatha wanted my mother to stay in Lufforain," Anthony began to explain. "Argatha knew my mother was starting to be plagued by dementia and wanted to prolong the process if my mother stayed in this world. So, there's something in the air that prevents the aging process here." Laurie was slowly saying the words out loud so that she understood what he was saying. "That's incredible. Why would she not want to stay here? What kept her away? My father had a hand in that." Anthony answered with a hint of bitterness. "He liked this place, but he wasn't attached to it. He wasn't born here, so he felt he could never live here full time. That's one of the things they argued about often. Argatha was in my mother's head, trying to get her to move here, and my father would rather have his wife live with dementia sooner than later, but in a world she belonged in." Anthony looked up at the sky and sighed heavily. "My father was his way, or no way kind of guy. But his logic was hard to argue against. I'm sure he had other reasons too. You'd be surprised at how many humans come from your world and don't want to stay," said Harmon from the rear of the pack. "I'm sure it's for the same reasons that Ed has, or he had. They weren't born here, so there is a sense of unwelcomeness and no real attachment to this place. But the abilities you get are one hell of a bonus," replied Charles, as that was the one thing he had begun to enjoy using. "Does everyone get powers when they come through?" asked Laurie. "No," Harmon said quickly. "It's very rare, and the fact that Anthony and Charles have both got something is impressive. What about your parents, Anthony? Did they get powers? Laurie asked, and she wondered if it was common enough, that maybe she could possess an ability. Not one, Anthony answered. Laurie's hopes got down just a bit, but it wasn't enough to change her excitement of being in another world, parallel to her own. They moved on at a slow pace, and there was nothing exciting that came out of a bush or strange creatures that trailed around them at a distance for a change of scenery. Yet soon enough, the road widened, and Charles recognized the house on the right up ahead. It was Camille's home, and he wondered how the baby was doing today. It was only 2 days ago that he had rescued the child from the servants of Errol. They rounded the corner, and there they saw people walking around the square and having warm conversations with one another. Charles found this odd because before, when he first arrived there, the only people he saw about was Camille screaming in a panic and her friend Mayara. It was like everyone else was afraid to leave their homes. "It's just how I remember it," said Anthony as he held a wide grin and made his way over to Merlin's Inn. The rest followed, and it wasn't long before people noticed Harmon and recognized Charles. They approached the pair of them and shook their hands graciously and thanked them for returning their town back to its former glory. Of course, Charles wasn't sure what they meant by that, but he'd be lying if he said the gratitude wasn't welcomed. They entered the inn, and thankfully, there was a set of double doors for the front entrance so that Harmon could enter. Inside there was the innkeeper, who acknowledged them immediately, and he too recognized Harmon and Charles. A band of other travelers, 3 men, sat on the right side of the entryway at a table, and all of them held their glasses in the air as Charles walked through. "Well, you're a popular one," Laurie said in a low voice, and was both surprised and a bit concerned. "All I did was return the child to its parents." "I didn't think it was that big of a deal," Charles replied, and before he could say another word, the innkeeper had come out from behind his desk and greeted them all. "Welcome travelers to Merlin's Inn. My name is Zarnier, and I must acknowledge our policy on bears. They are not allowed, usually, but since we know of this particular bear and yourself, lawman, the policy is of unimportance." Laurie had taken a step forward and asked, "So, if it was of unimportance, why would you say anything about it at all?" "Forgive me, my lady. I mean no offense, but as I stated, it is the policy for me to speak on behalf of the rules of my employer when I see a rule being broken," Zarnier answered and slightly bowed. Laurie blushed and turned to Charles and whispered, "No one has ever said, 'my lady,' to me, and I freaking love it." "I'm glad that you have come, lawman," began Zarnier. "The town manager would like to speak with you. He has requested from all of us in town to notify him of your presence should you return and to send you his way." "Well, here you are, and the town manager is just next door." Charles was caught off guard by the summons. Did the mayor happen to say why? No details on the matter were given, but he was stern with his instructions. Zarnier answered. "Well, it sounds like I don't have a choice." Charles then leaned into Laurie and whispered, "Stay close to Harmon and do not go out of this building on your own." She nodded in response to his request, and Charles said goodbye to Anthony and Harmon and then left Merlin's Inn. The building next to it on the left belonged to the town manager Thaddeus Green, and his building was also where they harbored the prisoners. Outside the building, one man sat in a rocking chair, and when Charles walked up to the door, the man nodded his head. Charles entered, and across the room on his left was a large desk, and Thaddeus was sitting there going over a piece of paper. "Well, look who couldn't just stay away, it's the lawman." Thaddeus stood up from behind his desk, and he had a wide grin and was pleased to see him. He made his way over to Charles and shook his hand. "Charles, let me just say, we the people of Jordan's Post appreciate what you and Harmon have done here." "Is Harmon here as well?" "Yeah, he's here. He's with some friends of mine next door at the inn," Charles answered, and he began to look over the large room. There was a hall that led away from Thaddeus' desk to the west part of the building. On the right side of the room, there was a woman who was writing away about anyone's guess, and she never once looked up to acknowledge his presence. In the back of the room, there was a stairway leading down to what Charles could only assume was where they kept the criminals. "Nice place you got here, it's very clean." "Thank you," Thaddeus graciously accepted the compliment. "I have guards on rotation who clean up after the place. Creator knows I'm not capable of cleaning a damn thing myself. Just ask my wife." Thaddeus laughed and took a few steps back where he sat down upon the top of his desk. "Look, I'm gonna get right to it. The reason why I wanted to talk to you is something that makes the folks of Jordan's Post uncomfortable." Charles opened his ears and mind to what the town manager was about to say. Thaddeus looked down at his hands and scraped out some dirt in between one of his nails with a small knife that he grabbed from his belt. Charles was just now realizing that there was a bit of an accent in Thaddeus' voice, as if it was from the south, just a little more well-spoken. "The servants of Errol are a big deal here in the West," Thaddeus began. "Their movement has been plaguing the Brunel forest for hundreds of years. At first, they were just lost souls trying to find their place in the world. A man by the name of Randall Presentpint came along and all those lost souls found their way to him. Randall offered knowledge and a home for those folks. In exchange, they were supposed to practice his teachings, which was trying to communicate with the god known as Errol. And wouldn't you know it, that's when his reach overstepped the boundary of the law. You see, he wanted his followers to do things in Errol's name. Not just scribble some nonsense on a building to get a message out, but rituals. These rituals, he claims Errol himself spoke to him in a dream and gave him instructions for a way to summon the god himself back to Lufforain." Charles had a strange thought just then. He was reminded of the dream that he had, back when he and Shawn had stayed the night with the wood elves. The figure that spoke to him, which he could never see the man's face. Charles wondered at that moment if it was possible that in his dream, it was Errol speaking to him. "Look, Thaddeus, this is a great story, but when does all this begin to pertain to me?" Charles was now thinking that the town manager was wasting his time. Thaddeus narrowed his eyes on Charles. "William, the man who you knocked out and brought back to us and said he was one of the captains of the servants of Errol. Well, his daddy is none other than Randall Presentpint." "Holy shit," said Charles with wide eyes. "So, is that why the people here in Jordan's Post are so relieved? I put the leader's son of the Errol misfits behind bars, stopped the Dark Lord himself from entering a child's body, and they think that I have somehow put a stop to the rituals." Thaddeus nodded his head in agreement. "They are happy for that fact, Charles, but they don't see what I see. Yes, you've done a great service putting William away, saving the baby and all that, but here's what I see. When word gets to Randall, and it will, that his only son, his pride and joy, and the very one to take up his mantle when Randall himself passes on. When he hears about his son being imprisoned, he will come to get him." Charles had scratched his chin and thought. "You really think he is able to? Come on, man, you're the town manager. You have guards at your back, and surely if you needed more men, then the Western Kingdom could spare you a few." Charles still wasn't sure what Thaddeus was getting at. "You make it sound like what I did was worse than letting William complete the ritual. Look, no one knows what will happen if Errol returns to this world, but I know Randall Presentpint, and I know he will burn Jordan's Post to the ground to get his son back." Charles was frustrated, and for a good reason. He had put a man away for dark practices, aiding in child abduction, breaking into Nemo's bait, and using the shop as an area to perform an illegal ritual. All that, and Charles feels like he didn't do the right thing. "So, what do you want me to do?" "I want you to talk to William Presentpint. I want you to figure out where his daddy is. Maybe we can catch Randall off guard before he comes down here with 100 or so armed followers. If you got to make a deal with the man that entails the servants of Errol leaving Jordan's Post for good, then I'm okay with that. I don't want a bloodbath in my town law, man." "Look, I hear you loud and clear, Thaddeus, but why me? Why can't you or one of the guards interrogate him?" Charles asked, and he did not want to waste any more time here, especially questioning a man he had already put behind bars. "Because you were the one to bring him in. He might feel intimidated by you and more willing to negotiate with you. Just come with me and give it a chance." Thaddeus slid off his desk and walked towards the stairs and stopped just as his foot hit the first step going down. "Hey Shaylee, make sure that door is locked and tell Carmine that I'm not expecting company for a while." The woman at the other desk had scribbled something down hurriedly on a piece of paper and then put her pen down and went straight to the door, and poked her head out to give Carmine the order. "She doesn't speak much, does she?" Charles asked. Of course not, Shaylee had her tongue removed long ago. "She comes from the east, where the wolfmen are in charge." Thaddeus took another step down and once again stopped. "She's never let me down. Not once, so I overlooked the missing tongue thing. Come on, let's go have a chat with our friend."